"You're not the man I married." That's what Sandra whispered over my ICU bed, her words sharp enough to pierce through the hiss of the ventilator. I wasn't even supposed to hear her. I was intubated, unconscious, comatose, or so they thought. But I heard her, every syllable, every sigh, every bit of that sentence twisted itself around my ribs and held on like a vice. Sandra used to tell me I was everything she prayed for. Now I was just inconvenient. That night, she left. The next morning, the nurses told me no one had come, but they were wrong. Dennis came, with her. My so-called best friend. He stood where she used to stand, arms crossed over his custom suit, looking me over like a man checking inventory. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. But I saw his reflection in the IV pole, smirking. The hospital lights were soft that afternoon, but something colder lit the room when Sandra walked back in. She didn't notice me twitching, she didn't notice my eyes struggling to focus. She just leaned close to Dennis and said, "If he doesn't wake up by Friday, we will start signing papers." And that's when I started counting down, not to die, but to rise. They said it was a miracle when I started breathing without the machine 3 weeks later. They said it was progress when I blinked on command, but no one knew. Inside, I was screaming. I remembered every visit, every word Sandra whispered when she thought I couldn't hear her. I remembered when she said she missed her freedom. I remembered Dennis's voice. "Give it 2 more weeks, babe, we'll own everything he left behind." They thought I was already gone. Nancy was the only one who stayed like she meant it. She wasn't blood, but she had a heart, my cousin's widow. She came every day, read the newspaper aloud, sat with me when the machines beeped all night. I used to wonder why, but now I think she just knew. When I finally moved my hand, it was Nancy who noticed first. She didn't cry, she didn't gasp, she just leaned close and whispered, "Good, now come back and burn them to the ground." 3 months after Sandra said I wasn't the man she married, I sat up in bed and asked for my phone. The nurse started. Nancy nodded. My hands were shaking. I had lost 40 pounds. My spine hurt like hell, but I still unlocked the phone and opened the file Nancy had prepared. A photo. Sandra and Dennis. In my hospital room. He had his hand on her lower back. She was smiling like a teenager. And there I was in the background. Pale. Hooked to 10 machines. I wanted to vomit. Nancy handed me a second folder. Legal documents. Notarized. Sandra had used the power of attorney I gave her before surgery to sign over our house. To herself. She'd moved Dennis into my condo, into my office, into my business. They forged my name to reroute dividends, redirect contracts, silence employees. Dennis even published a statement saying I had expressed wishes for him to carry forward my vision. My jaw clenched, my heartbeat spiked, the machines went wild. But I didn't break. I looked up at Nancy. "Help me send them to hell." She nodded. "Already started." It took me 10 weeks to walk. 2 more to speak properly, but I didn't tell anyone I was back, not fully. I wanted them to stay confident. Dennis was already pitching a new product under my company's name. Sandra was flaunting her new diamond bracelet on her healing posts. She said she was surviving the trauma of watching a husband fade away. I had faded all right out of her life, and I was walking back in, with documents, with footage, with lawyers. She said I wasn't the man she married. She was right. The man she married loved her. The man she buried in that hospital bed might have taken the betrayal. But the man who rose from that ventilator, he had a courtroom waiting, and she was about to meet him. Before Sandra whispered those words to me in the ICU, before Dennis stood beside her smirking over my paralyzed body, before Nancy silently slipped court files into my lap, I was a man people respected. My name is Scott Willard. I was 41 when everything collapsed. CEO of an engineering firm I built from my parents' garage. Born with a heart condition, I was told I might not live past 30. That taught me to move fast, work harder, and never waste time. So, I didn't. I lived on deadlines and caffeine. My employees called me relentless. My clients called me obsessed. Sandra once called me unstoppable. She used to laugh when I brought my laptop to date nights. She said it was so typically Scott. But that laughter faded as time went on. I didn't catch it at first. Not until it was too late. Sandra entered my life like spring after a harsh winter. I met her at a tech conference gala. She wasn't in tech, she was an interior consultant for the venue, tall, graceful, and magnetic. She was everything I wasn't. Where I was logical, she was charming. Where I lived by bullet points, she lived in poetry. She didn't just enter rooms, she redesigned them. She approached me first. I was staring at my phone, drafting a proposal. She leaned across the bar and said, "You must be the only person here who looks more interested in spreadsheets than champagne." I looked up, she smiled. That's how it started. Sandra had a past, one she never hid, but never elaborated either. Her mother was distant, her father wealthy but absent. She'd grown up around lawyers, private schools, and the kind of casual emotional neglect that shapes a person to mask pain with polish. Still, I believed her when she said she loved me. Back then, she had a way of looking at me that made even my insecurities go silent. We dated for a year and a half. She moved in 6 months in, said she liked my quiet, my steadiness. She said she felt safe, and I felt honored. I proposed after 2 years, under the same tree where I first kissed her. She cried, said yes instantly. Our wedding was small. She didn't want a circus, just a lakeside, white flowers, her close friends, my cousin Nathan's widow Nancy as her bridesmaid, and Dennis as my best man. Dennis and I had been friends for nearly 15 years. We met when I consulted for an energy firm. He was the in-house strategist, smart, clean-cut, persuasive. We bonded over late-night Thai food and boardroom politics. He was the guy who helped me tweak the first funding pitch that got my company off the ground. I trusted him with financials, strategy, even passwords. Back then, he had no reason to betray me, or so I thought. Dennis wasn't in our lives daily after the wedding. He had his own ventures, his own network, but every few months, he dropped by. Dinners, golf, weekend stays when he was flying through town. Sandra always greeted him warmly, but never suspiciously, at least, not in a way that made me pause. I didn't notice how often Sandra laughed louder when he was around, or how she began referencing things he said more than me. I brushed it off. I was busy, expansion phase, we were going international, I was hiring regional managers. Sandra said she understood, she promised she'd always be there. Then came the heart failure scare. It started with dizziness, then chest pressure. My cardiologist said the aortic valve was failing faster than expected. Surgery wasn't optional, it was urgent. I was given 6 weeks to organize my affairs. I sat across from Sandra, terrified, asking her to hold things together if I didn't make it. She held my hand and said, "You're going to be fine, but if anything happens, I'll protect everything you built, I promise." I signed the temporary power of attorney the next morning. Nancy was the only one who looked uneasy. We were sitting in the waiting area of my office, going over some staffing changes, when she said, "You trust Sandra a lot?" I nodded. "She's my wife." "She wasn't always," Nancy replied gently. "And Dennis has a way of sneaking into gaps." I smiled weakly. "You don't like Dennis, do you?" "I don't trust people who never lose." That was the last serious conversation I had with Nancy before my surgery. What happened next was told to me in fragments. The surgery was complex, recovery, worse. I slipped into a medically induced coma due to complications. My muscles atrophied, my lungs failed to adjust quickly. I was unresponsive for several weeks. Sandra told the board I was improving. She told employees I was on retreat for mental and physical health, and then she began consolidating power. She shifted funds, moved key clients, updated passwords. Dennis assisted, smiling through boardrooms, sending out policy memos, restructuring departments, in Scott's best interest. Meanwhile, Nancy kept showing up. She wasn't even on payroll, but she stayed, made sure my assistant didn't get fired, followed paper trails. She visited me daily, sometimes sitting beside me for hours in silence. Nurses said she was the only one who brought food for staff, who cleaned my mouth when saliva tubes failed, who turned off the harsh fluorescent light above my bed when everyone else forgot. When I woke up, I couldn't speak, but my eyes moved, my fingers twitched, and Nancy noticed. She didn't celebrate, she didn't cry. She leaned in and said, "We have work to do, Scott." At first, I didn't understand. I thought she meant therapy, recovery, but she had already collected evidence. Emails between Sandra and Dennis. Financial statements, hospital room entry logs, everything. When I was strong enough to process it all, Nancy walked me through the timeline. 4 weeks into my coma, Dennis began staying at our penthouse. Sandra had a new security code installed. She listed Dennis as an emergency contact, above Nancy. 2 weeks later, my firm's West Coast office was restructured under a shell company Dennis controlled. Sandra had been attending galas alone, talking about moving forward. She wasn't grieving, she was evolving. Nancy showed me photos, texts, even Sandra's social media posts, carefully curated images that hinted she was starting anew while her husband was still breathing through tubes. It broke me, but not for long. I began writing again, first scribbles, then documents, then a legal plan. Sandra had said I wasn't the man she married. She was right. The man she married would have swallowed the betrayal, quietly rebuilt, and walked away. But the man she buried in that ICU and forgot to kill? He was about to stand up, with witnesses, with evidence, and with nothing left to lose. Nancy never once asked me for anything. Not recognition, not repayment. She just wanted me to get better. But I saw what this had done to her too. She had lost faith in people after her husband died. She had buried grief in silence. But watching Sandra and Dennis steal my life out from under me? That relit something in her. She wanted justice, and so did I. By the time I could walk unassisted, the lawsuit was already drafted. Power of attorney was revoked, bank accounts were frozen, the surveillance footage was in safekeeping. Sandra thought I was recovering slowly. What she didn't realize was, I was rising methodically. Every breath I took was a countdown, every step I walked was a strike preparing to land, every word I spoke was going to echo in a courtroom. Dennis once told me during a late-night project, the best way to win is to let your opponent believe they've already won. So I did exactly that. And now, Sandra and Dennis were about to find out, the man they tried to erase never left. He was just watching. The first thing I did after regaining my speech wasn't call my parents or thank the surgeons who'd saved me. I called my lawyer. But I didn't call from my number. I used a prepaid SIM Nancy had picked up for me 2 days before. She didn't ask questions, she never did, but her eyes had that calm readiness, she was waiting for this moment too. Sandra thought I was still days away from speaking, that the slurred murmurs were just random spasms. She even told the head nurse I shouldn't be allowed to sign anything because I wasn't mentally stable yet. The nurse nodded politely but told Nancy everything. The staff liked Nancy. She was quiet, but she watched everything. By then, Dennis had officially moved into our home. He'd even replaced my toothbrush. Sandra kept calling it temporary. She told mutual friends she just needed support through my uncertain health. What no one realized was that I was reading everything, texts, emails, even press statements. Dennis issued a company-wide memo. As per Scott's wishes, I'll be managing an interim strategy until he returns, which may be indefinite. My hands trembled reading that. Indefinite. He made it sound like I was never coming back, like I was already dead. Nancy didn't say anything that day, just brought me water and helped me sit up. That night, I had my first panic attack since waking. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Alarms blared, nurses ran in, Nancy was outside in the hall, pacing. She didn't know what triggered it. But I did. It was Dennis's voice in my head saying, he's not coming back, and if he does, he'll never be the same. He was right about one thing. I wasn't the same. And I had no intention of coming back the way they expected. I waited another week before letting Sandra see me. I had the nurses keep my charts vague. I asked Nancy to act like my condition had stalled. I even made sure my limbs looked weaker than they were. When Sandra finally walked in, wearing soft beige tones and her designer coat, she looked like she was visiting a distant relative, not her husband. She barely looked at me. Instead, she talked to the nurse in the hallway first, gathering updates, gauging whether I could think, speak, remember. Then she stepped inside, alone. Her perfume hit me first, the same one she wore the day we signed our prenup. She sat beside me, slowly, carefully, like I might break under pressure. "Hi," she said softly. "It's good to see you awake." I blinked. Let her believe that's all I could do. She reached out and took my hand. "I know you probably don't remember much. It's been hard for me too." She sighed. "But I've kept things going, Just like you asked me to. The house, the company. Dennis has been helping. My fingers twitched in hers. She didn't notice. I didn't want to worry anyone, so I told people you were recovering quietly. It's better that way. Less chaos. She leaned forward, brushing hair behind her ear. I know we've grown apart a bit. But when you're better, we'll talk through it. Okay? Then she kissed my forehead, like a priest closing the lid on a casket. She thought I was done. She thought she was safe. But she forgot one thing. I built systems for a living. And my memory wasn't just intact, it was weaponized. The moment she left the room, I spoke my first sentence aloud in days. She just lied to me. Nancy walked in with her notebook. She's been lying for months. That night, I requested all the security footage from the hospital. Nancy had already flagged the dates where Dennis and Sandra visited together. On some nights, they came in after visiting hours. Sandra had charmed the staff, saying she didn't want to be seen by press. On 2 occasions, she even stayed past midnight. One clip showed Dennis sitting where she sat today. He didn't speak to me, he just looked at the machines. "This is your legacy," he muttered. Then he unplugged my tablet from the charger and pocketed it. He didn't know the room had hidden audio backup. Nancy had made sure of it. At this point, I had 2 options: wake up publicly and risk them covering their tracks, or pretend long. Or to let them dig their own graves. I chose the latter. The following week, Dennis announced a leadership restructure at the firm. My COO, Marshall, resigned after 30 years. I found out through a press release Nancy handed me before breakfast. Sandra posted a photo of herself with Dennis at a benefit event, captioned, "Grateful for the ones who stay when times get hard." There were no pictures of me at that event, just Dennis adjusting her collar like a lover. I stared at that image for 10 minutes. Then I whispered, "It's time." Nancy nodded. She brought me my laptop. I logged into my offshore archive server. Password, the date Sandra first said "I love you." She'd never guess. She hadn't remembered it in years. Inside the archive were scans of our original company agreements, video logs of board meetings, insurance policies, backup copies of stock ledgers. Everything I needed to prove the timeline of Sandra's betrayal. Everything Dennis had signed while pretending to act under my instruction. Sandra had transferred assets to her name under the power of attorney clause, but she'd overstepped. She didn't know the clause expired the day I left the surgical ward, even if I was unconscious. Our lawyer had warned us when we signed it. She never read the fine print, she just assumed. And Dennis, he didn't know that Sandra's access to my business accounts was limited by a secondary failsafe I'd put in place 5 years ago. A biometric lock that required my physical authorization. He had bypassed it using forged fingerprints, which meant he was now guilty of federal fraud. I drafted a case summary and emailed it to my lawyer under an alias account. Nancy delivered notarized copies to 2 trusted board members and the private investigator I'd quietly hired the week prior. Everything was in motion. And still, Sandra thought I was silent. Dennis thought I was broken. They didn't know I was building the storm. The day I officially signed my name again, I used a blue pen, the kind Sandra hated. She said it looked cheap. I wanted it to be the ink that ended her career. That same day, Dennis filed a proposal to liquidate one of our smaller divisions. He listed me as co-author. I hadn't touched the company in months. Nancy had already gotten a hold of the internal email string. Dennis used my email, my digital signature, but I hadn't logged into that server in nearly half a year. My forensic expert confirmed the IP address was tied to his girlfriend's apartment. Sandra didn't just cheat on me emotionally, she helped stage my professional assassination. I watched them on the hospital news later that night. Local finance reporters were praising Dennis's bold strategic leadership during my absence. Sandra stood next to him, smiling softly, clutching a crystal plaque they'd awarded the company, in my honor. The camera zoomed in on her ring finger. My wedding ring was gone. Replaced with a sapphire band I didn't recognize, the same one Dennis gave his ex-girlfriend 3 years ago. He'd had it customized. I remembered because he once asked me to help him choose the setting. Now it was on Sandra's hand. And I was done waiting. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. I was erased. My name only appeared when they needed sympathy. When it came to ownership, leadership, credit, they had rewritten me out of my own life. But they forgot I wrote the final drafts. And mine always ends with accountability. The conflict had begun. But it would not be a fight. It would be a quiet dismantling, a lawsuit here, a frozen account there. One board member turned, then two. And when Sandra and Dennis finally noticed what was happening, it would already be too late. No one talks about the silence after betrayal. Not the kind you hear in movies, the dramatic screaming, the accusations hurled across rooms. I'm talking about the kind that presses against your chest like a weightless stone, heavy but invisible, breathable but suffocating. That's what I lived in after Sandra left the hospital that day. The silence. I didn't eat much. The food didn't taste like anything. The nurses said I needed calories. Nancy said I needed justice. I said nothing at all. I kept replaying it in my head, the way Sandra walked in, pretending to care, the way Dennis's name rolled off her tongue like they were teammates, the smile she wore, the subtle pat she gave my shoulder before walking away like a nurse comforting a terminal patient. And all of it, every single second, happened while I was still alive. That was the part that hurt the most. I was still breathing, still fighting, still there. But to her, I was already gone. I began to dream again. Sometimes it was the beach where we got engaged. Sometimes it was the office I built from scratch. Sometimes it was her, in the mirror, crying, and I'd ask, why? But she'd smile and walk away, leaving Dennis in her place. One night, I dreamed I was back in the ICU, unable to move, and Dennis was laughing at me. Sandra stood beside him, holding his hand. Then she turned to me and whispered, "You should have died when you had the chance." I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. Nancy was already at my side, holding a wet cloth to my forehead. I didn't ask how long she'd been sitting there. I didn't want to know. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked softly. "No," I said, but I did. I just couldn't yet. How do you explain to someone that the person who once kissed your forehead during thunderstorms is now plotting your erasure? I used to believe Sandra and I had something rare. We didn't have explosive chemistry, we didn't argue every week or make up dramatically, we were quiet, steady. That's what made it feel real. Until I realized, quiet doesn't mean loyalty. Some betrayals are loud, others arrive in silk. The days dragged on. Nancy brought documents, emails, medical reports and video files. I had everything I needed to destroy them. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. I was still grieving. Not for Sandra, not even for Dennis. I was grieving for the man I used to be. The one who believed that love could fix things. The one who thought building a legacy meant people would protect it when you couldn't. The one who believed Sandra loved him enough to wait, to fight, to hold his hand through a real crisis. That man was gone. In his place was someone colder, sharper, someone who watched silence like it was data, who measured every smile, every pause in conversation, every carefully worded email from Dennis's new assistant. I felt like I had stepped outside my own skin. I wasn't healing. I was observing. Each day, I forced myself through recovery, walking farther, lifting more, breathing deeper, not because I wanted to live, but because I refused to let them think they'd won. Pain became fuel. Every time my leg shook, I thought of Dennis moving into my bedroom. Every time my shoulder burned, I remembered Sandra's smile in that press photo. Every time I couldn't sleep, I opened old voicemails from clients thanking me, reminding myself I mattered, but what hurt most wasn't what they stole, it was how easily they discarded me. Dennis had been my friend. He knew I'd had heart issues since I was 22. He knew my backup passwords, my company culture, the names of my employees' children. He helped me design our mentorship program. I even paid for his rehab after he got hooked on stimulants during a crunch year. And yet, he was the first person to bury me while I was still breathing. That betrayal somehow was deeper than Sandra's. I could understand why she left. People break, people run. But Dennis? He calculated. And that made it worse. There were moments, brief, gut-wrenching moments, when I asked myself if I was to blame. Maybe I worked too much. Maybe I took Sandra's loyalty for granted. Maybe I let Dennis get too close. Maybe I expected too much and gave too little. Nancy caught me staring at the ceiling one afternoon, eyes empty. "You're not the villain here, Scott," she said. I didn't answer. She sat down beside me, opened her tablet, and pulled up a picture. It was from our wedding, Sandra in white, me in black. Dennis holding a glass of champagne, blurred slightly in the background. His smile was crooked, but his eyes were dead. "Look closely," she said. "He's been waiting for this." I looked. She was right. He wasn't happy. He wasn't celebrating. He was watching, like a man waiting for a clock to hit 0. Later that night, Nancy came back with tea. I hadn't touched the dinner tray. She sat across from me, silent, letting the air settle. Finally, I said it. "I don't know if I'm hurt or humiliated." She took a sip, then looked at me. "You're both," she said. "But you're still standing." That hit me harder than any betrayal. Because she was right. I was still here. Sandra had rewritten our story without my consent. She'd played a widow in front of cameras and a puppet master behind the scenes. Dennis had played the loyal second-in-command while gutting my firm from within. But I still had breath. I still had a voice. And soon, I'd have control again. I made a vow to myself that night, not to win, not to expose them, not to punish, but to reclaim my name, my company, my dignity. And the version of me that never needed their validation to begin with. Because Sandra was right, I wasn't the man she married anymore, I was the man she tried to bury. And men like that? We don't stay buried, we rise. And when we do, we don't shout, we sign, we file, we testify. We walk back into the rooms built to destroy us, and we rebuild them, stronger than before. The emotional storm hadn't passed, but I was learning to walk through it without an umbrella. Let the rain fall, let the sky break, let the sea island speak. Because soon, the courtroom would, and I'd be ready. The plan was already in motion. Dennis and Sandra were weeks away from facing the lawsuits. I had built a wall of evidence, lined up key witnesses, and triggered the internal audit at my firm. Nancy had quietly approached the compliance officer and handed over encrypted emails. Financial irregularities were beginning to surface. Sandra was already panicking in private. Dennis was lashing out at junior employees. But just when I thought the pieces were locked, everything shifted again. It began with a letter. A plain white envelope slid under my hospital room door. There was no sender, no seal, just my name written in small, tidy cursive. Inside, 2 things, a photo and a lab report. The photo was old, slightly bent at the corners. Sandra, years younger, maybe 19, sitting on a bench in what looked like a university courtyard. Beside her was a man I didn't recognize, blonde, glasses, gentle smile. Her hand was on his. The lab report was dated 8 months ago. DNA testing. The subject, a male minor, age 5. Father, unconfirmed. Presumed paternal match, Dennis Langford, 0.00%. Presumed paternal match, Scott Willard, 0.00%. I blinked, confused. Then I looked closer at the attached sticky note, written in the same handwriting. "He doesn't belong to either of you." I didn't understand at first. Sandra had never told me she had a child. She'd always said she wanted children, but the timing wasn't right. In fact, we'd argued about it 6 months before my surgery. She said she'd lost the feeling that maybe motherhood wasn't for her. But if this report was real, there was a child, and Sandra had hidden him. Nancy walked in as I sat frozen, the paper trembling in my hand. She took one look at my face and shut the door. "What happened?" I showed her. She took the report, skimmed it, then looked at the envelope again. "I've seen this handwriting before," she said quietly. "Where?" "On a note Sandra once threw away. I only caught a glimpse. It was signed M. I assumed it was her cousin." "Do you think it's real?" Nancy didn't answer. She was already pulling out her tablet, typing into a private search engine. Within 10 minutes, we had our answer. The man in the photo with Sandra? Marcus Ellery. She had dated him in college. An architecture major, quiet, soft-spoken, disappeared after graduation. No social media, no business profile, practically a ghost. But buried in an old university archive was a student blog Sandra had written during her final year. A single line stood out. "Marcus said he wants to travel the world with me. I wish I could follow him." Nancy exhaled sharply. "That kid in the report, it's theirs, isn't it?" I didn't answer. Because suddenly, everything made sense. Sandra had disappeared for 3 months a year before she met me. She'd said she was freelancing in Europe. She never showed photos, never shared details. That child had to have been born during that window. She never told me, not even once. So I started asking questions. Nancy helped me hire a private investigator. Within 48 hours, we had confirmation Sandra had given birth in a small private clinic in Austria. No father listed on the birth certificate. No public records in the US, no adoption or guardianship files, but the child existed, and he was currently enrolled in an elite school in Connecticut under a different last name. Nancy clicked on the enrollment form, the listed guardian, Victoria Lane, Sandra's mother. I sat back, stunned. Sandra had a son, and she'd buried him under another identity, another address, another life, hidden from both Dennis and me. The first thought in my head wasn't anger, it was grief. What kind of mother does that? Then I remembered something. A year before my surgery, Sandra had flown to New York alone, saying she needed time to recenter. She said the stress was too much, that she needed space. I'd agreed. I booked her the hotel myself. Now I realized, she wasn't decompressing. She was visiting her son. The betrayal deepened in a way I wasn't prepared for. This wasn't about love anymore. This wasn't just theft. This was Sandra rewriting her entire identity, erasing chapters of her life and inserting Dennis and me wherever it suited her. She never wanted a child with me, not because she didn't want children, but because she already had one, and he didn't fit the story she'd built around being my wife. Nancy stayed quiet as I paced. "She lied to everyone," I whispered. "She let me think I was the problem." "She lied to herself too," Nancy said. "That's what makes her dangerous." I wasn't sure what to do. My case against Sandra and Dennis was solid, but this was personal. This was raw. This was a child being raised in silence, his father vanished, his mother pretending he didn't exist. I didn't want to weaponize the boy, but I needed answers. So I reached out. I sent a message to Victoria Lane's private foundation, posing as an old university friend of Marcus, asking about Sandra. A week later, I got a reply. From Victoria. "Don't contact us again, you don't understand what you're meddling in." The next day, Nancy received a text from an unknown number. A single sentence: "Back off or Scott's condition gets leaked." That was the moment I knew we'd hit something deeper. This wasn't just about betrayal. This was about control. Sandra had spun lies for years, engineered them into foundations, embedded them into people's memories like bricks in a wall. And I had just found the loose one. Nancy looked at me. "Will we go forward?" I nodded. "But we don't touch the child." Her voice softened. "You sure?" I was. He didn't ask for this, and I wouldn't use him like she used me. But I would find Marcus, and when I did, I would give him what Sandra never did, the truth. This new revelation didn't destroy my case, it sharpened it. Because now I understood the core of Sandra's deception. She wasn't just unfaithful, she was unrecognizable. And maybe, just maybe, she'd been that way all along. I just hadn't looked closely enough. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not in temperature, but in energy. Every person inside, lawyers, assistants, board members, media, watched the doorway like something was about to explode. It was. The air shifted the moment I walked in. Not wheeled, not carried, walked. On my own 2 feet. Sandra's head snapped up like she'd seen a ghost. Dennis stiffened, his jaw tensed, that smug little smirk he always wore was gone. I made my way to the defense table slowly, each step deliberate. The cane in my right hand wasn't for necessity, it was for drama. It clicked against the tile floor like a countdown. Tick, tick, tick. I sat down beside my lead attorney, nodded once, then faced the judge, calm, collected, alive. The judge adjusted her glasses and glanced toward the plaintiff's table. "Mrs. Willard," she said, "would you like to proceed with your final statement?" Sandra stood up. She wore all white. Of course she did. She always wore white when she wanted to look clean. "Yes, Your Honor," she began, her voice sweet and soft. "My husband, Scott, has suffered a terrible medical event. In his absence, I was left to maintain our lives, our finances, our companies. It was overwhelming. I admit, I may have overstepped, but everything I did out of love." She paused for effect. "I never gave up on him, not truly. But sometimes we change. And when he woke up, he wasn't the same. He wasn't kind, he wasn't stable, he was vengeful." I didn't blink. She continued. "I asked the court to show compassion, for both of us. I made mistakes, but Scott's mental and emotional state should not justify the public humiliation he's causing." The judge nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mrs. Willard." Then she turned to me. "Mr. Willard, you may respond." I stood up. Every camera turned. "My wife," I began, "has said I'm not the man she married." I looked at Sandra. "She's right. The man she married would have let this go. He would have stayed silent, rebuilt quietly, and hoped she'd come back to her senses." I took a step forward, no cane this time. "But I'm not that man anymore, and that's not my fault, that's hers." Gasps rose behind me, reporters scribbled. I turned to the judge. "For the record, Your Honor, I was not unconscious for the full duration of my recovery. I heard everything: Sandra's meetings with Dennis, the way they joked about my condition, her plan to shift assets into her name before my death certificate was even drafted." Sandra's eyes widened. Dennis shifted in his chair. "But that's not the worst of it," I said. "The worst part was what she said when she thought I couldn't hear." I paused, then mimicked her tone exactly. "If he doesn't make it, we're free." A collective hush fell over the courtroom. I reached into my briefcase, removed a small device, and pressed play. The audio echoed through the speakers, Sandra's voice, word for word. "If he doesn't make it, we're free." Followed by Dennis's, "He's already gone." I turned back to the judge. "These recordings were captured by ICU surveillance. My legal team has confirmed their authenticity. I submit them as Exhibit C." The clerk approached and collected the device. Sandra looked like her soul had been snatched from her spine. Dennis leaned back, arms folded, trying to maintain his calm. But I wasn't done. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs claim I'm mentally unstable, that I am pursuing this trial as some kind of vendetta." I held up a flash drive. "This contains email threads between Dennis Langford and Sandra Willard in which they conspire to replace me as CEO, liquidate a portion of the company under a shell LLC, and split the profits." I handed it to the clerk. "Exhibit D." I looked directly at Dennis now. "You should have deleted your drafts, Dennis. You always did have a sloppy habit of copying instead of forwarding." A ripple of laughter emerged from the audience. The judge tapped her gavel once, suppressing it. "Furthermore," I said, "the financial transfers executed by Sandra using my medical power of attorney were only valid for 21 days post-operation. They occurred after that window, which constitutes fraud under state law." I turned to the jury. "She didn't just betray me emotionally, she betrayed me legally, financially, and personally. She removed money from accounts meant for my medical care and funneled them into vacation homes and handbags. She signed contracts using my digital signature without consent, and she instructed Dennis to issue statements in my name, statements I never approved." I reached into the folder again. But none of that shocked me like this did. I pulled out the lab report, the one with the DNA test. This is a paternity report for a 5-year-old boy, Sandra's son. A child she hid, a child who belongs neither to me nor Dennis. Gasps again, Sandra's face paled. I didn't flinch. She abandoned her child, hid him, gave him to her mother to raise like a secret, and lied to both of us about who the father was. She led Dennis to believe he was the father, and when she realized that wouldn't work, she ran. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Do you have verification for this?" "My PI traced the child's records. My legal team can verify the documents, birth records, and travel logs. They've been submitted in a sealed folder as Exhibit E. I turned slowly to Sandra. You didn't lie because you were scared. You lied because you wanted control. You curated grief. You manufactured loyalty. And when that wasn't enough, you weaponized your absence. I turned to the judge. I'm not asking for punishment. I paused. I'm asking for the truth, recognition, and a return of everything that was stolen. The judge leaned back, hands clasped. The courtroom was frozen. Then she turned to Dennis. Mr. Langford, would you like to respond? Dennis stood slowly. Your Honor, he said, voice tight, this is a personal feud between a bitter man and his ex-wife. Scott was mentally unstable for months. He suffered cognitive damage. These accusations are emotional, not legal. The judge raised a hand. Then why did you send this? She held up a letter. My eyes narrowed. Dennis's pupils shrank. This letter, she continued, is an email sent to the board of directors urging them to vote for Scott's removal due to terminal cognitive failure, a medical status never confirmed. The email included falsified notes from a doctor who has since denied writing them. The judge turned to Dennis. You didn't expect that physician to be subpoenaed today, did you? Silence. She tapped her gavel. Due to mounting evidence of falsified documents, misappropriation of authority, and financial fraud, this court will be ordering a full external audit of all transactions made under both Mrs. Willard and Mr. Langford's direction during the defendant's incapacitation. Sandra slumped in her chair. Dennis ran a hand over his face, sweating. And as for the claims against Mr. Willard's stability, she continued, looking at me, I see a man who recovered through silence, compiled evidence, and presented it with clarity. That, in my experience, is not instability, that is resolved. I sat back down, breathing slow. Nancy smiled from the second row, eyes shining. She had seen this moment long before I did. The judge concluded. Pending further review, this court freezes all assets under joint titles, suspends Mr. Langford from any role associated with the Willard Corporation, and authorizes a preliminary ruling in favor of Mr. Willard. The courtroom erupted. Flashbulbs, typing, shouts. Sandra didn't speak. She couldn't. Her world had finally stopped spinning. Dennis tried to get up, but two plainclothes officers stopped him. Not yet, one of them said. We have got more questions for you downtown. As they escorted him out, Dennis turned to me one last time. You really came back from the dead, didn't you? No, I said. I was never dead. You just weren't looking. He looked away. Sandra stood slowly, walking out of the courtroom as if she were floating above it all. But her hands trembled. Her heels clicked unevenly. The echo didn't sound like control anymore. It sounded like a collapse. I stayed seated. The cameras pointed away now, but Nancy didn't move. She just placed her hand over mine. And for the first time since I woke up in that hospital bed, I let myself exhale. Not out of pain, but because I had finally reached the part of the story where silence turned into strength. And the court, at last, had listened. The trial was over, but my name was still everywhere. Every tabloid headline carried it in bold. Every financial news panel had a segment about the CEO who came back from the dead to take down his traitorous wife and best friend. There were podcasts dissecting every courtroom moment, interviews with former employees who now claimed they always suspected something, and online think pieces debating whether I was a hero or a man pushed too far. I didn't care what they called me. They could label me ruthless, cold, calculated. But they'd have to admit one thing: I won. Sandra's accounts were frozen within 72 hours of the court ruling. Luxury purchases flagged, transactions reversed. The vacation home in Marbella, seized. The joint estate in California, frozen under asset review. Dennis's professional licenses were suspended, his name struck from 3 companies he'd used as fronts to channel money. Clients dropped him, business partners ghosted him. He went from being quoted in magazines to being ignored in court hallways. But that was just the start. Sandra tried to launch a rebrand, a public apology video posted to her social accounts titled My Side of the Story. It was polished, lit beautifully. She wore minimal makeup, the kind designed to make her look raw and honest. Her voice quivered at all the right moments. She claimed she'd made emotional mistakes, that grief had made her vulnerable to manipulation, that Dennis had used her. The comments weren't kind. The video had 22 million views in a week, but no one believed her anymore. Because a day before that video dropped, I leaked a second one. Security footage from the hospital, not the clip I played in court. This was longer, quieter, more damning. It showed Sandra leaning over me in my coma, brushing my hair aside like she still cared, and then saying, almost affectionately, "If only you'd stayed in your lane, Scott, I could have loved you forever." That single line shattered any sympathy she hoped to gather. Sponsors cut ties. Her book deal was cancelled. Her influencer contracts dissolved like sugar in boiling water. I didn't speak publicly, I didn't grant interviews, I didn't appear on late-night shows, despite being offered a seat on nearly every one. Instead, I focused on the rebuild. The board reinstated me unanimously. Dennis's puppet hires were dismissed. Nancy, who never asked for recognition, was offered an executive role in public relations. She refused the title but took the position as my personal advisor. "She deserves the whole company," one employee whispered. She did. Because when no one stood by me, she did. Not for power, not for status, just for truth. We quietly reopened the mentorship initiative Dennis had shelved, hired back the assistant Sandra tried to fire, repaid staff who had been undercut during the financial shuffle. People expected me to burn the firm down out of spite. Instead, I made it stronger. That, to me, was real revenge. But Sandra's story wasn't over. 3 months after the ruling, I received a letter from her attorney. Hand-delivered. She wanted mediation, not over money. Over the boy. The child she had hidden from me. From Dennis. From the world. I had done my own research, hired a second private investigator. Marcus, the man I saw in that old photo, was dead. Car accident in Peru 5 years ago. No will, no claim of paternity, no family to contest custody. Victoria Lane, Sandra's mother, had placed the boy under a fabricated guardian alias. The truth was simple. Sandra never wanted to be a mother, not fully. She wanted an heir for legacy, but not the responsibility. When the boy was born, she quietly had him stashed away, like fine jewelry never worn, just stored. Now that her life was unraveling, she wanted to secure what was left. The boy's name was Ethan. He was 5, he liked dinosaurs and string cheese and asking a million questions. I had never met him, but I'd seen photos. He looked nothing like me. He looked like her. But his eyes, they were different, curious, searching. I met with my lawyer. I didn't want custody, I didn't want to punish Ethan for his mother's crimes, but I wanted to make sure he was safe. The investigation proved what I feared. Victoria was unfit. She was undergoing treatment for early-stage Alzheimer's. The child was being cared for by nannies and groundskeepers with no consistency, so I filed a petition, not to adopt, but to appoint a neutral guardian. Sandra fought back viciously. She showed up to the hearing with tears and flowers and a sudden desire to be a mother. I showed up with documents, surveillance, school reports, therapy notes. The court sided with me. A court-appointed guardian was named. Ethan would be raised with proper care, education, and access to therapy. Sandra lost visitation rights. She appealed. She lost again. At that moment, her final lifeline snapped. The press stopped covering her. Even her online defenders gave up. She tried to move to Italy but was denied a visa due to ongoing financial investigations. Dennis disappeared from the public eye. Rumor had it he'd changed his name and was working in some obscure crypto startup in Prague. Let him run. He would always be exactly what he feared most, irrelevant. As for me, I moved out of the penthouse. It was filled with too many ghosts, too much curated silence. I bought a small 2-story brownstone near the water. No elevators, no staff, just me and a space I built from scratch again. Nancy visited often, sometimes with books, sometimes with wine. We never spoke about what we were or weren't. We didn't need to. She was the only one who never lied. One evening, as we sat on the rooftop deck watching the city breathe under orange light, she finally asked, "Do you feel like it's over?" I stared out at the skyline for a long time. "No," I said, "but I feel like it's behind me." She nodded. "That's close enough." In the months that followed, life settled. I gave speeches again, quiet ones, Not TED Talks or business expos, community lectures about ethics and resilience, about betrayal, about recovery. People called me brave, but I wasn't. I was angry. I just learned how to aim it. One morning, I received an email from Ethan's guardian. He'd drawn a picture of 3 people, a man, a woman, and a small boy holding both their hands. No labels, no names, just stick figures. The email said Ethan called the man, the one who saved me. I stared at it for a long time. Then hit print. I framed it and hung it in my new office, above my real degree, beside a blank canvas. A reminder that not every legacy is built with brick and steel. Sometimes, it's made of silence, of choices, of not turning into the thing that tried to destroy you. I never spoke to Sandra again, not once. I never wrote to her, never answered her lawyers, never acknowledged her name in public. That was my final revenge. To become so untouchable, she no longer even existed in the same world as me. She said I wasn't the man she married. She was right. The man she married believed in partnership. The man she buried believed in love. But the man who rose from that ventilator? He believed in justice, and he gave her to the courts, where her story finally collapsed. As for me, I didn't just recover, I rewrote myself. And this version of me? He sleeps well, every night,